Hey everyone, I am back with reading a bit more of The Destiny of Man. I've been reading the chapter on the ethics of creativeness, and I'm absolutely loving this chapter. It's probably my favorite, and I have so many thoughts on it, but I want to cold read where I am. I think that I've read this section or part of it in the past because I was looking for specific quotes for a paper I was thinking about doing, but I do want to reread it just because I'd rather, kind of have some continuance in this chapter. So thanks so much for joining me. Let's see what we can gather. And if you hear noise in the background, it is my dishwasher. This section is part 3 of the Ethics of Creativeness. I'm starting on page 142 for those of you who have maybe the same edition that I do. I don't know what it is though. And it's called The Part of Imagination in the Moral Life, the Ethics of Energy. Which I love that phrase, the ethics of energy. It sounds so metaphysical. And anything having to do with creativity and imagination, I think, is so helpful. Okay. The ethics of creativeness presupposes that the task which confronts man is infinite and the world is not completed. He has been talking about, Berdyaev has been talking about in this chapter, the idea of time and how the ideals of the gospel can't really become law in the social world because they are ideals of an infinite, beyond time eternity. And he also talks about creativity as being truly what it is in the initiation stage. When we think about ideas in the beginning, even before we start to realize them, that is when we have the intensity of feeling. And when we start, and he says that is sort of in the realm of the heavenly, the infinite. When we move into trying to become disciplined, work with the materials, work in a human finite time and space, and accomplish or achieve sort of the vision that we had initially, he says the fire is cooled, and that really isn't the essence of creativity. So I think maybe those comments will be helpful for us to kind of understand this section. He also talks about, which I don't know if he will continue in this section, but he also talks about how we need to and we can transmute certain shadow-based, maybe like lower frequency would be another way to say it, passions into something that's creative. He contrasts lust with love and eros. Eros has an important relationship to creativity. And so he has an interesting section on sexual desire. And he says that, well, I don't know if he's exactly critiquing physical intimacy, but he does say that physical sexual desire can be transmuted into something that is more creative. He gives the examples of when we have pity for someone or we have compassion for someone, then that quiets physical sexual desire. And so that is kind of one of his examples. And then he says when we have like an intense erotic love, that is also a time when physical sexual desire might be quieted. So I would love to make a video about that, but I just felt more called to kind of continue on reading. Creative imagination is of fundamental importance to the ethics of creativeness. Without imagination, there can be no creative activity. Creativeness means, in the first instance, imagining something different, better, and higher. Imagination calls up before us something better than the reality around us. Creativeness always rises above reality. Imagination plays this part not only in art and in myth-making, but also in scientific discoveries, technical inventions, and moral life, creating a better type of relations between human beings. One thing that I think about here, and I have been contemplating throughout this chapter, is fantasies and daydreams. I have been thinking about my own kind of fantasies and daydreams that I kind of entertain myself with, maybe before I'm going to sleep, or maybe in particularly like reflective times of the day. And I've been contemplating how uncreative they are, how I keep going back to the same kind of themes and tropes and characters, and there's just slight variations in my fantasies and daydreams, but they're really kind of basic. And so I've been thinking of, how do that would be a good space and opportunity, I think, for many of us to become more creative, to, as he says, imagine something different, better, and higher. Maybe more fantastical kind of settings. I mean, we're not limited in our fantasies and daydreams in the same way we are in our day-to-day lives, right? So why not let that be kind of a playground for something? As an example, you could imagine walking through a door into a world and sort of change or undo one law of nature, like for instance gravity, or imagine a different color of the sky. Like I had this one sort of scene I was imagining that the place where I was kind of a shallow sea, and there were trees growing out of it. And I was sort of a hybrid human being, kind of like fantastical bird, and I had like these amethyst feathers everywhere, and I had just my body was a lot sort of like it took up more space, and I wasn't graceful like a human being, but I was graceful like this like avian creature, and I was kind of wading through, and that's kind of just all I came up with at that moment. But I thought, it could be something that I kind of draw on. And as I'm grading my students' papers at the end of this semester, we still have 2 more weeks left at the university, and I've just been noticing how creative all of them are. in their assignments. Like I had to adjust my computer, bring it closer to me. But I'm not sure. Okay, anyway. Sorry. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but for one of my assignments, and I think it was just a creative assignment. I wanted them to juxtapose creativity and spirituality. And one of my students, or they did, I don't know actually the gender, they did a choose your own adventure kind of PowerPoint. So it was so fun because I actually could go through it and see the different variations they had, and it started out with, you realize you're dead, and there's a museum there, and then there's I can't remember what it was, like a cafe or a restaurant or a Waffle House or something. And you had to, which one do you want to go to, or what's your first reaction to that? And then it just kind of leads you through, different possibilities. And I just thought that was so interesting. And I've been trying to, over the past few semesters, give my students opportunities to be really creative, alongside, more traditional academic assignments. And I think Carl Jung also talks about creativity as a way to communicate with the unconscious. So continuing on to 143, there is such a thing as moral imagination, that's interesting, which creates the image of a better life. It is absent only from legalistic ethics. No imagination is needed for automatically carrying out a law or norm. In moral life, the power of creative imagination plays the part of talent. By the side of the self-contained moral world of laws and rules, to which nothing can be added, man builds up in imagination a higher, free, and beautiful world lying beyond ordinary good and evil. And this is what gives beauty to life. As a matter of fact, life can never be determined solely by law. Men always imagine for themselves a different and better life, freer and more beautiful, and they realize those images. The kingdom of God is the image of a full, perfect, beautiful, free, and divine life. Only law has nothing to do with imagination, or rather, it is limited to imagining compliance with or violation of its behests. But the most perfect fulfillment of the law is not the same as the perfect life. He talks about earlier in this chapter how sort of dissatisfying or unsatisfying, what am I trying to say? And lacking creativity, Kant's categorical imperative is. He says that morality actually takes a lot of creativity because we can have sort of our ideals or standards or our sense of various moral duties. But every situation is different. Every person that we're interacting with is different. And we have to take everything by a case-by-case basis. So I thought that's a really interesting perspective, that morality requires, that good morality takes, or successful morality requires creativity and requires our freedom to explore what that might mean for ourselves. Imagination may also be a source of evil. There may be bad imagination and phantasms. Evil thoughts are an instance of bad imagination. Crimes are conceived in imagination. But imagination also brings about a better life. a man devoid of imagination is incapable of creative moral activity and of building up a better life. The very conception of a better life towards which we ought to strive is the result of creative imagination. Those who have no imagination think that there is no better life at all, and there ought not to be. All that exists for them is the unalterable order of existence, in which unalterable law ought to be realized. Jacob Boehm ascribed enormous importance to imagination. The world is created by God through imagination, through images which arise in God in eternity and are both ideal and real. Modern psychologists and alienists also ascribe great importance to imagination, both good and bad. They have discovered that imagination plays an infinitely greater part in people's lives than has been thought hitherto. Diseases and psychoses arise through imagination and can also be cured through it. I think that's really interesting that, he does say, and I think this is quite nuanced of Berdyaev, and I always appreciate nuance. It's not that, and I'm kind of thinking kind of affectionately of Byung-Chul Han, how he sort of lacks this in his books. So nothing really for Berdyaev is, no ideal is perfect in or always good in the actual world, because he sort of reiterates that we live in a world of sin. We live in a world of shadow and trauma and these self-destructive, self-sabotaging sort of habits. And so even sort of prescriptions from the Bible can be imperfectly carried out and even switch over to the pernicious. And I really appreciate him kind of exploring both possibilities. It kind of reminds me of the Jungian idea of this word that I can never think of how to pronounce. It's something like enantodromia or something. That's completely wrong, but those of you who have read Jung will know what I'm talking about. It's the tendency of something to turn into its opposite. And I think that Berdyaev is not uncomfortable with paradox. The ethics of law forbids man to imagine a better world and a better life. It fetters him to the world as given and to the socially organized herd life, laying down taboos and prohibitions everywhere. But the ethics of creativeness breaks with the herd existence and refuses to recognize legalistic prohibitions. To the law of the present life, it opposes the image of a higher one. And I think that's really interesting, how sometimes, even in the name of the ethical or the appropriate or the good, our moral policing can restrict us to the point of suffocation and sort of paradoxically making us, I guess, veer away from what can truly be healthy and beneficial. And, along the lines of Berdyaev and the paradox and nuance, I would never say that, I could give an example maybe of a kind of a concept that I think is restrictive, but that wouldn't mean that I think that practice is always and forever like never the highest good, if that makes sense. I just think that in some situations, going to the extreme, it can be unhealthy. And I don't really feel like giving the example I'm thinking of. But maybe you can think of examples of how sometimes a law that's intended to bring order and be the sort of most appropriate life can actually be inhibiting of, I guess, a healthy and good life. All right, next page. The ethics of creativeness is the ethics of energy. Quantitative and qualitative increase in life's intensity and creative energy is one of the criteria of moral valuation. The good is like radium. He uses this kind of analogy a lot. The good is like radium in spiritual life, and its essential quality is radioactivity, inexhaustible radiation. The conceptions of energy and that of norm come into conflict in ethics. The morality of law and the morality of creative energy are perpetually at war. If the good is understood as a real force, it cannot be conceived as the purpose of life. A perfect and absolute realization of the good would make it unnecessary and lead us completely to forget moral distinctions and valuations. The nature of the good and of the moral life presupposes dualism and struggle, i.e., a painful and difficult path. Complete victory over the dualism and the struggle leads to the disappearance of what, on the way, we had called good and moral. To realize the good is to cancel it. The good is not at all the final end of life and of being. It is only a way, only a struggle on the way. The good must be conceived of in terms of energy and not of purpose. The thing that matters most is the realization of creative energy and not the ideal normative end. Man realizes the good not because he has set himself the purpose of doing so, but because he is good or virtuous, i.e., because he has in him the creative energy of goodness. The source is important and not the goal. A man fights for a good cause not because it is his conscious purpose to do so, but because he has combative energy and the energy of goodness. Goodness and moral life are a path in which the starting point and the goal coincide. It is the emanation of creative energy. I think that this is really helpful. Berdyaev, when he is kind of giving us a new perspective, and when he says that, it's about energy, it's something within, it seems like he is kind of leaning toward or helping us, like shining a spotlight on the esoteric and sort of, creativity, like becoming as creativity and process as creativity and feeling and emotion and sort of, I guess, love as being important. And I was thinking of this in terms of identity and our practices, and also evaluation and judgment. In my epistemology class this last semester, which I still have a paper that I have to do for it, and can't really do until I finish grading, but thus that is the predicament of being both a professor and a student. I noticed some comments throughout class that struck me as rather gatekeeping. There was little discussions here and there about who is a good philosopher, and that there are a few really brilliant philosophers, there are a lot of okay ones, and there are people who can't do it at all. And it seemed to me a conversation that was focused not actually on philosophy and what it means to be a philosopher, but what it means to be professionally competent, and or it just seemed to me to be more about achievement and maybe technical skills rather than what philosophy actually is. And it's so, I guess, easy for me to see what it really means to be a philosopher because it's right there in the Greek. It's having a love of wisdom. And how can you evaluate someone's love? I think that only the person themselves can say whether they are a philosopher or not. And there's no judgment to people who don't necessarily love wisdom or pursue it with a passion and feel like eros oriented toward it. But if we're kind of trying to decide like who is a philosopher and not, I don't think we can see that from the outside. We can maybe look for signs, but are we able to read all of the possible expressions of having a love for wisdom? So I think that it doesn't mean that logic and argumentative rigor and being able to point out what a logical fallacy is and name it, or write in the style of the analytic philosophers. Like, I'm not saying that that isn't important and really valuable. Those are some of the gaps I had going into this semester of a class on epistemology from the analytic tradition. And I delight and actually love writing papers and doing these assignments and reading analytic philosophy. It's something new to me, and I realize that it is super important to fill that gap in order to continue to teach intro to philosophy in a more holistic way and provide my students with like everything, like all the important aspects of it. And so I really appreciate the technicality in learning how to be more concise in what I'm saying and work from like premises and understand if an argument is valid and sound. Like, I think all of those things are great, but it's not what makes anyone a philosopher. I mean, in the symposium, in Socrates/Diotima's speech, he's talking both about Eros and how Eros is the child of poverty and plenty. Why? And why does he say that gods can't be philosophers? It's because there has to be an element of unknowing. There has to be an element of lack. If you are pursuing something, you are seeking it, you are continually and always on the path of, seeing something that you want ahead of you. And that is joyous and that is amazing. And I've had to struggle with this semester and in this summer with not getting into the philosophy department full time at my college and trying to decide if getting a PhD was a means to an end or an end in itself, because I wouldn't want to pursue it if it weren't an end in itself. And so I had to really reflect on myself, like, why was I having such a hard time being rejected? Why did I feel grief? What is missing? And I was wondering if it wasn't that Well, I mean, first of all, I think being in the philosophy department would just, my goal is being surrounded with philosophy as much as possible. That's happiness for me, doing nothing but philosophy. So there is that. But I think that I also had my ego involved. And I think it might have also been about the markers that say that you belong somewhere and that you are something. But for me, I think I'm getting into an understanding of identity not as something to give you permission in a certain space or to validate you externally or to compare yourself with, not others, but yourself, like maybe comparing your ideal self to your present self. But I think identity is more helpful when it's an orientation, when it helps us know thyself and be able to say, yes, this is me. And like for me, and I think for many of you, we love reading. We become energized. Life becomes brilliant when we're reading books and we're talking about books and we're sharing ideas and we're in this realm of a conversation that has depth and has nuance, and we're sharing and there's curiosity there. And I think that, and in the particular books that I like are books that philosophers have written alongside psychology and spirituality and mysticism and mythology. And so, that's what makes us philosophers. It doesn't matter if we have a degree. It doesn't matter if we have an academic position. We are fulfilling who we are, and we are fulfilling our love when we are spending time doing that. And I was thinking of it also in terms of teaching and also in terms of writing. You can kind of look at, and even language learning. Some of us, I think we live in a society that makes a statement that if you don't produce something externally that others can see and evaluate, then you are not that. You are not a writer unless you have published books. You are not a good teacher unless you check all these boxes. But I think that, for instance, you can't really evaluate who is a teacher and who isn't, again, based on the external. Because for me, I've been reflecting that teaching is a love of participating in another's becoming. I think that's the kind of excitement I have on day one of a class, and the sort of stress or anxiety because I feel the weight of my responsibility. Like, how do I create this space as a stage for all of our becoming? And that's why I think I get so excited and so happy. Like, I am a parent, kind of praising her children, even though, my college students are adults. But I feel that kind of sense of pride. Like, look how joyous they are. Look how empowered they are. Look how they found something in the class that they're really interested in, and they are getting to be on the stage and teach. And, I feel so much happiness to see they're sort of stepping into themselves and shining. And so even if I have days, and I have many, where I think I don't know if I should be doing this job because I don't know how good I am at it, I think it would be, and maybe some of you out there who are struggling with owning an identity, you can remind yourself and try to think of, well, how do you define that? Like, we can define philosophy as a love of wisdom, and there can be many types of wisdom, right? So maybe, something like writing, you just have to see how you define it. And success doesn't always mean publishing a book or writing for other people. I was thinking about how writing for me is maybe giving form to my inner world. How I feel as if my inner world is like a big cauldron, and I'm constantly kind of stirring and stewing and transmuting, doing my dream work, doing my shadow work, reflecting, all of those things. There's a lot of focus. My life is almost like 90% inner work. And so I think what writing could be for me is kind of psychic ventilation, sort of, I don't exactly know what that'll mean. It's a very recent thought. But I've always thought about writing kind of mixed with shame. Like, I start projects and I don't complete them. And, so that's a failing. Maybe I should just give up writing. But I think in a like Berdyaev way, I have to kind of maybe relook at that. And if there's some kind of pull that I have, if writing is always on my mind, then there must be kind of a message that it's trying to give me. And it would benefit me to be more creative and try to look at it at different angles to see what that might mean. And again, I still don't know, but it's what I've been sort of thinking of, like my own kind of definitions of things and what is really important or what is really valuable. And the last example, and I would love if you would put your own sort of examples in the comments. But my other example is language learning. I realize that I am passionate about languages. There's something about listening to various languages that just calm my nervous system, and like it's like a massage for my brain. It brings me great peace, and I have sort of desires to listen to particular languages, even if, and I don't know what any of them mean, but like non-English languages. But sometimes I wake up in the morning and I just have to listen to like a German podcast or my playlist of Spanish music or whatever it is. And I've always felt bad because I've tried to commit to a particular language and study it and have my goal be fluency, and I can just never do it because I always think about the languages I'm not listening to and not studying. And so it's like, take the term polyglot. Maybe I can't, from most people's perspectives, call myself a polyglot because I am not past the beginner stage in any, second or third language. I am not. I don't know if I can ever actually go beyond, a beginning stage. But I have the soul of a polyglot. My practices are that of a polyglot. So I think we need to, free ourselves from the shackles of what he's saying, the herd mind, and come up with our own sort of ideas and perspectives. And so this is just an example of a way I've been trying to be a little bit creative about understanding myself and exploring who I am. I have absolutely no idea where I was in this. Okay, I don't want to miss anything. Okay, I think I'm here. Man realizes the good not because he has set himself the purpose of doing so, but because he is good or virtuous. Okay, I've read this. I'll just continue. I.e., because he has in him the creative energy of goodness. The source is important and not the goal. A man fights for a good cause not because it is in his conscious purpose to do so, but because he has combative energy and the energy of goodness. Goodness and moral life are a path in which the starting point and the goal can coincide. It is the emanation of creative energy. And this is the last paragraph that I'll read. But from the ontological and cosmological point of view, the final end of being must be thought of as beauty and not as goodness. Plato defined beauty as the magnificence of the good. Complete, perfect, and harmonious being is beauty. I'm going to read that again. Complete, perfect, and harmonious being is beauty. Teleological ethics is normative and legalistic. It regards the good as the purpose of life, i.e., as a norm or law which must be fulfilled. Teleological ethics always implies absence of moral imagination, for it conceives the end as a norm and not as an image, not as a product of the creative energy of life. You know, to be creative in languages is not to have, I think like norms would be, become fluent in this language at this particular time, or finish my 5th draft of this book and publish it by this particular time. Like maybe those, not that those aren't great goals, but maybe there are other possibilities, there are other realizations for what you love to do. Beauty is the image of creative energy radiating over the whole world and transforming it. Teleological ethics based on the idea of the good as an absolute purpose is hostile to freedom, but creative ethics is based upon freedom. Beauty means a transfigured creation. The good means creation fettered by the law which denounces sin. The paradox is that the law fetters the energy of the good. It does not want the good to be interpreted as a force, for in that case the world would escape from the power of the law. To transcend the morality of law means to put infinite creative energy in the place of commands, prohibitions, and taboos. I love that last list. So I think, to kind of conclude this particular discussion, I would ask all of us, in what areas of life are we being legalistic? And are any of those areas causing us unnecessary suffering? And if so, how can we use our creativity and imagination to transcend them and into the realm of the truer good, of play, of something that might be healthier for us, even though it will be potentially misinterpreted and not seen or understood by anyone else.